I'm Dr. Lynn Singer, Deputy Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Case Western Reserve, and also Chair of the Steering Committee for the International Center for Autism Research and Education. President Snyder could not be here this morning because she's traveling, but she wanted to send you her greetings.
Good morning. I'm Barbara Snyder, President of Case Western Reserve University. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to our campus today. I regret that I cannot be with you in person for this gathering that holds such enormous promise. I believe passionately in the power of partnership. When individuals and institutions truly collaborate, the results typically exceed anything we could do alone. In 2007, for example, Case Western Reserve received what was then the largest ever grant the National Institutes of Health had ever given in Northeast Ohio. That $64 million award came to Greater Cleveland for many reasons, but never would have happened at all save for one. Every major hospital system here participated. In the years since, some of the project's greatest individual achievements have emerged because researchers drew on the experience and expertise found across our community. Similar advantages apply to this initiative. Northeast Ohio is blessed to have outstanding scientists and physicians with extraordinary knowledge in areas relevant to autism. But to make a meaningful impact, they needed more than knowledge. They had to have resources too. Enter the Cleveland Foundation, the Mount Sinai Healthcare Foundation, and the Zita M. and Joseph Diorio Foundation. Together, these three organizations supported a critical initial planning grant for our International Center for Autism Research and Education, ICARE for short. In addition, the Hartwell Foundation, based in Tennessee, awarded a grant for biomedical research and also invested in individual scientists at Case Western Reserve. To each of these organizations and the individuals within them, please know that you have our most profound gratitude. Autism spectrum disorders affect 1 of every 68 children in the United States today. Its prevalence has increased more than 100% since the year 2000, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention report that it is the nation's fastest-growing developmental disorder. Solving a mystery as perplexing and often heart-wrenching as autism simply cannot be about individual ego or organizational acclaim. We must call upon our collective strengths. ICARE includes Case Western Reserve, Cleveland Clinic, Metro Health Medical Center, and university hospitals. It involves places like Monarch School, the Prentice Center of the Positive Education Program, and Beechbrook. We invited you to today's meeting because ICARE has reached a seminal moment. Its collaborators are poised to leap forward in basic science, clinical translation, and community engagement. Meaningful progress is within reach, if we can add a few more key elements: leadership, data, and clinicians who take initial discoveries and translate them into effective treatments. Put more simply, advancement requires investment. Your speakers today will share more details about the center and what it has accomplished to date. They will elaborate on their aspirations and the resources needed to realize them. And they will explain how your involvement can help Greater Cleveland become a place synonymous with efforts that have impact on children, families, and our communities at large. Many people have worked together to bring you here for today's important conversations. I want to acknowledge and thank two in particular, Dr. Lynn Singer and Dr. Tony Winchell-Boris. Their vision and leadership catalyzed Greater Cleveland's expertise in this area into a coordinated and promising movement. Thank you all again for joining us.
It is exciting to see so many of you here today interested in research on autism. I'd first like to acknowledge a few people, two special out-of-town attendees from the Hartwell Foundation, Dr. Fred Dombros, the president of the foundation, and Rusty Hensley, CEO of the Hartwell Foundation Corporation. The Hartwell Foundation, as you heard from Barbara, is unique in that it supports early-stage, cutting-edge research to advance children's health. And Case Western Reserve University has been the fortunate recipient of a number of these awards now. We also have today representing President Snyder, Bud Baselak, our provost and executive vice president, Raise your hand, Bud. And one of our deans, Cyrus Taylor, and Chuck Rozek, the Dean of Graduate Studies, as well as a number of our steering committee members, which are composed of members of the three agencies that you saw, Cleveland Clinic, University Hospitals, and Case Western Reserve. So Mike Manos, who is a member of our steering committee, as well as Giovanni Piedemonte, head of the Cleveland Clinic Children's Pediatric Department. And I don't see Nancy Roy's here yet, but she's on her way. So when she comes in, you'll see Nancy, who is also the chair of developmental and behavioral pediatrics at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital. So why is ICARE needed? Why do we need this? As you heard from Barbara, autism spectrum disorders are serious and complex neurodevelopmental disorders that affect social behavior, communication, and learning. They impact more than 1 in 68 United States children, and the symptoms can range from mild to severe, and ability levels can vary from profoundly delayed to gifted. The causes of autism are not known for the majority of affected individuals. To date, we have no cure, and available treatments are limited in their effectiveness, so that individuals who are diagnosed to be on the spectrum and their families face a host of challenges. Autism is especially difficult because most affected children are diagnosed after 3 years of age with no apparent symptoms as infants. And there's been a long history of blaming parents for actually causing the disorder, which we know now is not the case. The incidence of autism is rising at alarming rates, more than tenfold in just 2 decades, making autism, as Barbara mentioned, the fastest growing serious developmental disability in the United States. Autism costs the nation over $137 billion per year, a figure that's expected to significantly increase over the next decade. Medical expenses for individuals with an autism diagnosis are on average 4 to 6 times greater than for those not on the spectrum. In addition to medical costs, the intensive behavioral interventions that are needed can cost up to $80,000 per year per child. Thus, the overall costs to society are staggering. So with the number of cases growing, consider that autism is now more common in the United States than pediatric AIDS, juvenile diabetes, and childhood cancer combined. There's a great need for research into the causes of autism that can be translated into treatments that will reduce the morbidity and societal burden. As we develop knowledge, we need to put into practice the findings that we have that may prevent autism. For example, from the research that's been done to date, we know that taking prenatal vitamins may reduce the incidence of autism. And we know that early treatment can make a difference. So that we need to identify the causes earlier, we need to diagnose cases earlier, and we must conduct research that can capitalize on our knowledge of genetic and environmental causes. These findings can then be applied to patients and will have an immense impact on prevention and treatment. Today, we want to share with you our journey to the development of the International Center for Autism Research and Education that we call ICARE at Case Western Reserve University. Over 3 years ago, community members asked the university, what is being done in Cleveland to tackle autism? So for 3 years, researchers, clinicians, and community groups have been meeting together with national experts to learn together and to coordinate the research and clinical efforts in this community to address autism spectrum disorders. The results have surpassed our expectations, and you'll hear a bit about them today. And we are so grateful to the Cleveland Foundation, the Mount Sinai Foundation, and the Zita and Ralph DiOrio Foundation, whose grants have made our planning possible. Through this process, as you can see, all of our major medical centers have united with community partners to form a critical mass of existing and new researchers and clinicians to form ICARE. We've begun to address autism research in very unique ways and are at a critical point as we move from planning to implementation and growth. We seek your partnership and your support in moving our program forward. First, we want to bring to bear all the collective strengths of our major medical and educational institutions to address prevention, treatment, and ultimately to obtain cures for autism spectrum disorders. We need to translate, to take new discoveries in the basic sciences and create new treatments for families. We also want to train the future generations of researchers and clinicians that will be tackling this problem as well as other neurodevelopmental disabilities. And we want to educate and support the families in our community, so that our next speakers will illustrate for you what we have come together to do now to reach the goals of ICARE. Dr. Tony Winshaw-Boris, the chair of the genetics department here at Case Western Reserve University and the current director of ICARE.
Well, thank you, Lynn. I'd also like to welcome everybody here today and to our, I guess we'd call it sort of the launching of ICARE. Why are we having you come today? Well, as Lynn said, I think what happened was that we have been able to use the seed money from the Cleveland, the Mount Sinai, and DiOrio foundations, as well as seed money from our partner institutions, Case Western Reserve, the Case School of Medicine, Cleveland Clinic, and the University Hospital's Case Medical Center, to now bring together a critical mass of clinicians, scientists, and physician scientists to really tackle the problem of autism, which is a very complicated disorder. And this critical mass, we'll use that as a foundation to look at and assess patients with autism, to try to find and understand the multitude of causes, and then, because they're all individual cases, to try to find personalized treatments for each of those individual patients that will help them in the future. And we've brought together a team. Why do we need a team? Well, we need a team because, in fact, autism is a complex and heterogeneous disorder. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's complicated in that there are a multitude of genetic and environmental causes, and patients display a wide variety of secondary features, including GI disturbances, seizures, as well as intellectual disability. And every patient has a different mix of environmental and genetic causes, as well as having these different manifestations. And that's led some investigators to say that when you've seen one autism individual, you've seen one autism individual, because in fact it's quite heterogeneous. And even though all patients with autism and individuals with autism are linked by having problems with social interaction, with repetitive behaviors and communication and language, that's what brings it all together. Understanding and assessing the causes in any individual and providing those treatments is going to require a team. And so the team approach really involves this sort of a basic flow chart. The autism patients come to the clinic, and they can come to any of the clinics at any of the hospitals in Northeast Ohio for clinical assessment. And besides clinical assessment, there will be research assessment to try to understand the particular abnormalities that each of these individuals have. That's genetic and genomic, population studies, and detailed imaging studies as just some examples. But even from that point on, then, one has to determine what's wrong. And that can't often be done in the patients. One has to use then basic science technologies, animal models, for instance, patient cell models, to understand what causes autism in individuals and in general. If we can find any of those abnormalities in a model system, either animals or cells, then we could use a recently developed drug and chemical screening core that we've developed at Case Western Reserve School of Medicine for the variety of institutions. There's also one at the Cleveland Clinic, to try to find new therapies. And if we find such new therapies, then we have to go back to the clinic, go back to those patients to test whether or not those therapies have an impact. Now, this general flow chart in the ICARE is overseen by the steering committee, and the steering committee is listed in your single sheet, so I won't go over them, but here are the pictures so that you can place photographs and individuals with the names in the program themselves. And this committee, this steering committee, spans all the institutions. And so that the committee is going to oversee then what's going on in ICARE. But we have a wide variety of investigators and clinicians that are investigating autism, and you'll hear some of those from our next two speakers. But I just wanted to highlight a few things that are going on just to show you the diversity of our ICARE members. First of all, we have Jerry Mahoney and Barbara Lewis, who are training social workers and speech pathologists in interventions for children with autism. And this is a funded training program. We have Kiju Lee, who's from engineering, who's using robotics to improve socialization in autism spectrum disorders. Kind of sounds like an unusual approach, but it seems to be very effective. Kara Zhang from the clinic is studying autism and a particular gene that causes enlargement of the brain as well as cancer called PTEN, and it seems to be a common genetic cause in autism. We have Roberto Fernandez Galan, who's here. Roberto's assessing the functional brain activity in autism through MEG, and you could talk to him about that later. Jonathan Haynes, who's a new chair of epidemiology and biostatistics, as well as the head of the Computational Biology Institute that spans Cleveland Clinic, University Hospitals, and Case. Jonathan's, one of his specialties is studying the genetics and epidemiology of autism. And last but not least, Mark Griswold, who's developing novel brain imaging methodologies for studying a number of disorders, including autism. So this just gives you a flavor for what we're doing now. And again, this is, we've assembled this critical mass that we're going to hope to build upon in the future to impact autism. And not only in Northeast Ohio, which is where we are, but nationally. And after all, we are the International Center for Autism Research and Education, so we also expect and hope to have an impact internationally as well. So thank you very much. Next, I'm going to introduce Tom Frazier, who's the head of the autism program at the Cleveland Clinic and the Child Development Program. Tom?
Thanks a lot, Tony. Thanks a lot for coming on a cold morning to hear us talk about what I think is really a fantastic initiative that spans all the institutions and that has potential to make a difference in the lives of people with autism. These are families that need it because it is quite a significant and lifelong disability. I have really good news. The good news is that through the seed funding that Tony and Lynn have mentioned, that we already have started an autism database in Cleveland. And that database represents a collaboration between Cleveland Clinic Children's and the Center for Autism and University Hospital's Rainbow Babies and Children's Autism Center. And that database is a fantastic start. It's a start because it's allowed us to combine and collect common data across patients that are in our clinics. That common data is absolutely crucial to the research that Dr. David Katz is going to describe to you in more detail. That translational research that's ultimately going to lead to better treatments for patients with autism. Common data is extremely important because we need to be able to have a set of basic clinical characteristics on patients that can then be used both by clinical researchers and by basic scientists to make more sense of this really complex disease. The other exciting piece of this is that not only do we have a combined database, but that this database already has a large volume and strong potential for growth. We already have greater than 400 ASD diagnosed patients. We have more than 300 non-ASD patients. We have the potential through these clinics and through this effort to collect biological data that would allow us to really further leverage what we've already done, including collecting DNA so we can look at genetic changes, genetic variations associated with autism, RNA so we can look at the expression of those genes, and the microbiome as well. Now, at this point, the database is Cleveland Clinic Children's combined with University Hospital's Rainbow Autism Center. We see a possibility of expanding this fairly rapidly to other Northeastern Ohio locations. Places like KidsLink, Metro Health, Daily Behavioral Health, that have their own clinics that we can incorporate and that are interested in being a part. We really need to be able to sustain this effort, and we need to be able to make sure that we have core common data collection teams. This makes the data collection process more efficient and more reliable. The other piece of really exciting news is that Cleveland is rich in treatment programs for individuals with autism. We have existing structures and programs like the Learner School for Autism at Cleveland Clinic, the Monarch Center for Autism at Belfair JCB, the PEP program, and numerous other programs around Northeastern Ohio that allow us to develop collaborations to collect common data on treatment approaches that already exist in the community. And we have interest. In fact, there's a proposal already out between Learner School and Monarch to collect common data. We have the capacity, for example, at Learner School to make this process much more efficient than it's ever been. So a year ago at Learner School, with the support of the Pediatric Institute, and I want to acknowledge Dr. Piedamonte for this, has allowed us to get the seed funding to be able to turn over our entire data collection to an iPad-based, software-based data collection system. We collect thousands of behaviors a day on our patients. To be able to have access to that on a real-time basis is a power to examine treatment that we've never had before. By combining treatment programs and developing common outcome metrics, we can answer really important questions that we don't have answers to. For example, we can identify predictors of positive outcomes. We can identify the best methods to treat challenging behavior. We can learn how to tailor our early intensive. We all know it's important to identify kids early. We need to be able to tailor that intervention for kids. And we can identify optimal methods for adult transition. So before I end, I want to acknowledge Nancy. I know she's not here, but I really want to acknowledge Nancy Roizen because she's been a partner in building a common database and trying to identify and put together treatment programs that could work together. She's been a key component to this, and I think it's really important for us to acknowledge her hard work. I also want to mention that not only can other local schools participate in this, but this represents ICARE's reach to families and individuals with autism that are affected and that need our support. So I'm going to end here, but I want to bring up Dr. David Katz, who's really going to go through the translational research process and the possibilities that ICARE represents for enhancing that process. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to continue the theme that Tom introduced and share with you some great news. Dr. Winshaw-Boris and Dr. Singer shared with you the span of expertise, how blessed we are here in Cleveland to have depth and breadth in autism spectrum disorders spanning basic research in the genetics and neurobiology of the disease all the way to state-of-the-art clinical research and care delivery. And you heard from Dr. Frazier just now about how we have succeeded in creating a network of partners around the clinical piece. What I want to share with you is that we have also succeeded in knitting together the basic and the clinical science components to create what we call a translational pipeline for autism spectrum disorders here in Cleveland. Now, this kind of pipeline, what I mean by this is the network of relationships, infrastructure, and resources to take basic science discoveries made in the laboratory all the way through to the development of new therapies delivered to patients. And I want to point out that our community, what really distinguishes our community from many other cities around the country that have autism initiatives is not only the depth and breadth and the span of expertise from basic to clinical science, but it's also the desire, the will, and the commitment to work together in partnership to make this kind of dream come true, to make translation a reality. So what I'd like to do now is give you an example that illustrates this reality. And I'm going to draw on research on one particular disorder called Rett Syndrome, which is one of the most severe disorders on the autism spectrum. What distinguishes individuals with Rett Syndrome from the rest of the spectrum is that in addition to autistic behaviors, these individuals also have very complex neurologic and medical problems, problems with movement, problems with control of breathing, other cognitive issues, and so forth. It's quite a complex and devastating disorder. Children are born apparently normally, but within a few years, most of these individuals are completely physically and intellectually disabled. Now, Rett syndrome is a focus of research in my laboratory. My laboratory, by that I mean a basic science laboratory, in which we use mouse models in which the same gene that's mutated in human individuals with Rett syndrome is mutated in the mice, and those mice develop a mouse form of the disease which mimics the human disease. And this allows us, as Dr. Winshaw-Boris said, this kind of mouse model allows us to explore in depth the underlying mechanisms of the disease, and on that basis, develop potential new treatments. So this good news story I want to share with you about the translational pipeline begins with a discovery made in our laboratory just a few years ago, that a drug called ketamine, which is FDA approved for use in children for completely different purposes, we discovered quite serendipitously that at very low doses, this very same drug reverses symptoms of Rett syndrome in mice with the disorder. Now, this, of course, was exciting not only because it could show that with a drug we could reverse symptoms, but it's a drug which, as I said, is already FDA approved, meaning that the pathway to getting it into patients is much shorter than a newly discovered molecule that's never been tested in humans. So we entered into discussions with, and I should say that this research was funded by grants from the National Institutes of Health and Autism Speaks. You're going to see how this kind of pipeline requires the participation of many individuals. It really takes a village to build this kind of pipeline. So that's where the support came from initially. I then entered into discussions with my good friend Tom Frazier, who has tremendous expertise in not only the care of individuals and assessment of individuals with autism, but in clinical trials in autism spectrum disorders. And we began speaking about the possibility that could we actually take these findings in mice and develop a clinical trial paradigm. That then evolved into discussions with Dan Sessler and his group over at Cleveland Clinic. Dan is the chairman of Outcomes Research. Their business is clinical trials. And Dan also happens to be an anesthesiologist who knows this drug, ketamine, very, very well, so it's a natural fit. And together we decided that we would actually put this proposal out there and ask, could we actually leverage these basic science findings and get funded to launch a clinical trial on the use of ketamine in patients with Rett syndrome here in Cleveland. And I'm very, very pleased to announce publicly here for the first time that just a few weeks ago, we received notice that we have been awarded upwards of $1 million from the Rett Syndrome Research Trust to do exactly that. And that is to carry forward these basic science findings in collaboration with our clinical partners at the Cleveland Clinic and actually test the possibility that this drug, as we've shown in the mice, might actually reverse symptoms in human patients with Rett syndrome. Now, this is exciting for a number of reasons. First of all, this carries real hope that we're going to do something to really help these kids with what is a very, very devastating illness. This is also exciting because it demonstrates the proof of concept that this community has successfully now brought together all of the partners necessary at multiple institutions to take something from the basic science laboratory bench all the way through to a clinical trial, and we hope with positive results to help patients. But there's another reason I find this story exciting. I want to point out that this is also an example of leveraging the initial investment from the foundations that were named earlier. So Tom and I met and started talking because we were brought together at events funded by the planning grant. We didn't know each other until we started attending those planning grant events, talking about our common interests, and that's where the relationship started. And as you know, relationships are the key to these kinds of successful partnerships. The planning grant was also used to bring speakers here to talk about their expertise in autism. One of those speakers was the Chief Scientific Officer of the Autism Speaks Foundation. During his visit, we met, I told him about our work, and that led to funding from Autism Speaks to help get this work off the ground. So you see how we were able to leverage the initial investment to create something really, really great, as well as leverage the community of expertise that exists here. So I also want to say that this is not just about Cleveland. Of course, we hope that the treatments we find will have worldwide impact, but there's also greater impact for Ohio itself. Just yesterday, Tom and I hosted a group from University of Cincinnati Children's Hospital who are also working on developing treatments for disorders on the autism spectrum. Specifically, this was Craig Erickson's group that works on Fragile X. And Craig approached Tom about Tom's clinic becoming a site for a clinical trial that they're conducting because of the community of expertise that exists here now. So what we're doing in Cleveland really will have a reach, we hope, through collaborations like this throughout the state of Ohio, and that what we're doing here can really seed activities throughout the state as a whole. So just to restate what you've heard from the previous speakers, I think the proof of concept has been done. The potential is enormous. What we'd like to do, based on this record of success, is grow this pipeline, or I should say clone this pipeline. We'd like to have many molecules, and we do have other programs at other stages of development. We'd like to have many molecules coming into such pipelines, leading to the development of potential new treatments for disorders across the entire autism spectrum. So with that, I will close and bring up Linsinger again for some closing comments. Thank you.
And I think, David Layton, this is not the Keystone pipeline. This is the Case Western Reserve University pipeline. So, as you can see, our coming together and harnessing the considerable strengths of our Cleveland institutions has already yielded significant new collaborations and findings that will directly benefit our families and our community. So just through the leveraging of these funds, we ourselves have been surprised at how many sparks have flown and connections made through our planning grants and through university hospitals, Cleveland Clinic, and Case Western Reserve seed funding. So we've made significant strides, but we have so much more to do. We've been planning and seeding, and now we're here where we'd like to build. For me, this is a very exciting time because for over 20 years, I worked as a pediatric psychologist at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital and saw virtually every child under 6 that had a neurodevelopmental disability. Although my assessments could tell the parent, well, your child is this delayed or they can't communicate, in over 90% of the cases, with the exception of maybe Down syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome, we couldn't tell the parents anything else. We have no idea of the causes or what would be a specific treatment. We are now in autism where cancer research was 40 years ago, and I feel like we must have been on the same pipeline, Rusty. But we now are in a different space because we have the scientific tools, computational biology, genetics, neuroscience, imaging, stem cell research, behavioral phenotyping that can be done with the combined efforts of our Cleveland institutions will enable us to decipher the causes and develop the cures for this new epidemic. So at this time, we're very pleased with what we've done. We're very excited about the future, but we will need and we invite your support to achieve the goals that we've set forth that will benefit our families as well as families throughout the world. Thank you very much, and we're open for questions. Who wants to start? Yes, go ahead. Could you say who you are?
I'm Susanna Cray with Sisters of Charity Foundation, and I guess I just really want to applaud this great work and this presentation. And I just want to ask, to what extent is this center looking at the demographics of the population and studying children on the autism spectrum that might come from urban areas and urban neighborhoods, and to the extent, I'd just be interested because I haven't heard that. And the other piece I would just like to add is, to what extent is there any component that looks at environmental and nutritional factors associated with this disorder?
Right. Well, I'll start and then ask people to come in. I don't know if Nancy's here. Well, certainly the clinics from Rainbow, Metro, and in the school systems are seeing children from all areas and of socioeconomic status and developmental disabilities. So there is a wide range. We know nationally there is a concern from the NIH about healthcare disparities with this diagnosis, because certainly children who are poor in urban environments are not getting diagnosed as early, because as you heard, it's very expensive. And so the care is very expensive, the interventions are very expensive, and there is a healthcare disparity that's been identified, and we don't really know all of the incidents. In fact, in the NIH, in the Interagency Coordinating Committee's results, they felt, it used to be thought that in poor and minority populations there was less of an incidence of autism, but they've now come to the conclusion that that's simply that those children were not being addressed. So it is an issue. Angela Chicha, who is one of our investigators in speech pathology, has written a grant, and she's looking at language and communication early, and she's looking at one of the Cleveland Healthcare Centers. I don't know, Cyrus, if you know exactly where she is, or anyone else here, but that's one of the things she's looking at, because she's taking videos of children and looking at early communication that could identify autism earlier in one of our health centers. But it's one of the things we are seeking funding for so that we can expand and do this. Max, go ahead.
The issue is not diagnosis. I'm going to tell you that I think we're blessed in Cleveland to have a wonderful network of primary care providers for children, whether they live urban or suburban, it doesn't really matter. I think children are being identified. It's more of where do you go after that? And I think that's really the more important question, because when I deal with these families, you know, I can talk to them in the office, but what are the support services that they have? There's issues about parenting skills. There's a lot of things that go on. And Tom's work, where he's looking at the behaviors and things of this nature, is really critical to try to provide information, because I would argue that this is the kind of population that you can put together educational program, even in-home things. Once you've identified the target, you know, how to do it, but you need the data, which means you need to put them in the database and everything else of this nature. It's a slow process. So it's not, to me, it's still not identification. There's also a bunch of things about nutrition and everything else that we're not getting into.
But we also have Help Me Grow, which is one of the major groups that can identify early and then funnel. It's after that. Help Me Grow does identify many, many babies, but whether they're getting the services after that, we don't know.
There are projects there are studies being done worldwide looking at things like environmental factors, nutritional factors, and how they impact on the diagnosis. That I don't think that has to be replicated here. But what has not been done well is, and I think we can do, is what do you do after you've identified them?
So, Tony?
Just regarding what you were saying about populations, of course, what you underscore is what would happen when we're totally built out and have a comprehensive center, so you're absolutely right. But there are, in fact, investigations, we mentioned them as well, in terms of environmental causes, population studies. I'll just point out a person that I had up there, Jonathan Haynes, that's actually his specialty, is epidemiology and genetic and environmental epidemiology. So these issues are going to happen. We haven't gone into all populations, but I can give you one example from Jonathan's work in the Amish population in Ohio and in Indiana. So he surveyed almost all the families there for autism and found a remarkable thing. Autism is quite rare in the Amish population, and don't really know why that is. So a couple possibilities are environment and genetics. There certainly would be a possibility of doing that in that sort of a population. So it's just an example of how these studies can be extended into exactly what you're talking about.
Susan?
Well, I appreciate that question, because one of the things, first of all, Lynn, I think what you and your team have done, this is exciting, because I think we're sitting on so much knowledge in our community and so much goodwill, and if we can better organize it for great outcomes. What I just want to offer, this, I work at Positive Education Program, if we could do more outreach to the school districts, because at the end of the day, autism, if we look at Prentice, PEP, and the clinic, we're talking about a few hundred kids when there's a few thousand kids who have autism, and those few hundred are the most intense. But the majority are being served in the school district. So it's an interesting dynamic, right? Because it's a health diagnosis with an education intervention. And so what I'm just offering, if you think we could ever help an outreach to the districts and bringing them to the table, because that's where the kids are that I think we're talking about. And some of these parents, the challenge is they don't even know what their rights are around special education. And so many years go by before kids get the kinds of services
Just to
they need.
piggyback on that, we already are in the Cleveland schools. In fact, we have an outreach program at the Cleveland Clinic Center for Autism that through a small but very generous donation, we're seeing over 100 kids with autism in Cleveland schools right now. 4 different schools, including FDR, which I visited recently. Mr. Hayes at FDR, fantastic principal. And we're making a difference in those classrooms already. We've been in there for a year. We want to continue that. I think it's important. I think you're right. It's a medical diagnosis with an education, or at least a education / behavioral intervention treatment, and we have to do a better job for all the kids, not just the kids that can make it into specialty schools.
Would you explain what you're doing?
Just to complete that, we have a band that goes to the school.
Stand up. So it's hard to hear this. Oh, well, I guess you're being picked up.
Okay. So we have now a mobile clinic that goes to 3 different districts. And yesterday we signed a contract with the Euclid district. And the other 2 escaped me, but so the van is picked as a clinic, as a full clinic. We're going to be able to provide, there are at least other 5 schools that are interested in signing contracts. So we're creating a network to go to the school directly.
Jerry.
Lynn, could you talk a little bit about what's the international component of ICARE mean right now?
Well, right now we've begun to make, first of all, it's a worldwide issue, and we're going to learn a lot from the rest of the world. For example, there was a major study done in Korea that showed a high incidence, and there's a lot of speculation about that, but whether certain areas of the world, either through environmental causes or genetic causes, are more likely to have diagnoses. We're making connections in Brazil at this point, especially through the NSF type group that they have there, and bringing scientists in. Israel is another major connection, and we recently have in Taiwan, there's also, with one of our previous physicians here, who's now the Minister of Health there, we're making connections in Taiwan as well. So those, I think, are the 3 major areas.
About 10% or 20%, I'm not exactly sure what the percentage is, of the variance in autism cannot be explained by anything else, which has some people speculating that something's occurring in our world right now that is increasing the prevalence of autism. Can one of the Tony or David or Tom, can you address that that area of investigation and who perhaps is looking into it, and what are some of the culprits? Or is this even a problem that needs to be a concern?
So 2 biologic factors have been identified as contributing to a real increase in incidence. Still relatively small compared to the overall incidence, but significant nonetheless. And those are increasing age of parents, particularly increasing age of the father. For reasons that are not entirely understood, that leads to an increase in accumulation of mutations with DNA that contribute to the incidence. And the second is that we're saving more younger premature infants, and prematurity has an association with risk of developing ASD. So those are the 2 known biological factors.
Are there any suspicions of others?
Well,
factors?
Well, the vitamins seems to have been replicated. We don't quite understand it, but For example, one of the things I'm very hopeful about is if you've worked in this area, if you know what's happened with folic acid. When I worked at Health Hill, the old Health Hill Hospital, which is now the Cleveland Clinic Children's Hospital, we had many children, babies with spina bifida. And simply because the government has now put folic acid in the bread, we have half the incidence of spina bifida that we used to have. It's a dramatic example, and how that was discovered or found out, we don't know. And folic acid and prenatal vitamins does seem to be a factor in some of these studies that indicate that women who took those vitamins well before they were pregnant, for 3 months before they were pregnant, had a lower incidence of autism diagnoses. Now, it's all speculative. It's not been replicated, but it's certainly plausible. Another example that I think of with autism is PKU. Every baby now that's born is tested for phenylketonuria. And if you don't put that baby on a special diet, that baby will look normal but will rapidly become severely intellectually disabled by the time they're 2 years of age. Well, if you thought about it, it would look like, here I have a normal baby. If we didn't have that testing, and then over time, you'd end up with a very severely disabled child with no known cause. I don't know how that was discovered, but we do know now what causes it, and I suspect there are many other disorders like that that we will eventually understand. We know now certain specific genetic variants that do cause disability, like Down syndrome. We're going to identify many, many more of these, as well as methods of treatment. But you've got to do the research and you've got to keep looking. But this whole question of why there's an increase, some of it's diagnosis. We're identifying children earlier and people are willing to be identified. But there is the thought that the genetics don't change that quickly, so there has to be something. And there are some studies also that suggest living near pollution, highly polluted areas, or agricultural areas where there are more pesticides used. So it's quite speculative at this point, but there are a lot of questions, that there's some environmental interaction. Well, if there are no more questions, we invite you to have some more treats before you leave or take something. And thank you so much for coming. And we hope that we'll be engaged with you over the next 6 months or forever in working on this issue and making things better for our children. So thank you.